Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Constitution Day lecture at the King's College. This year, 2020, marks the 233rd anniversary of the Constitution. We're hosting our event a little bit early. Constitution Day is tomorrow, but we're close. We're the same week. And I'm delighted to have Dr. Stephen Knott join us to deliver the lecture for Constitution Day. Dr. Knott teaches at the U.S. Naval War College. He is a professor in the National Security Affairs Department there, and he has written a number of works over the year, particularly about the presidency. So his books include Secret and Sanctioned, Covert Operations in the American Presidency, Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, and Rush to Judgment, George W. Bush, The War on Terror and His Critics. And his most recent book is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, the decline into demagoguery and the prospects for renewal. And he's currently working on a book on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. So Dr. Knott is going to give a talk today about restoring the constitutional presidency. I look forward to what he has to say. At the end, there will be some time for Q&A, so be thinking about questions you may have as he is giving his talk, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So with that, Dr. Knott, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Paul. And thank you to the King's College for having me today. I'm delighted to be here. I have a very good friend who's on your faculty, Dr. David Innes. David and I attended graduate school at Boston College back when dinosaurs first roamed the earth, quite some time ago. But we became very good friends, and delighted to be here and looking forward to hearing whatever questions or comments you have to make following my talk. So as Paul said, I will be talking about the restoration of the constitutional presidency, although I'll be spending the bulk of my talk discussing how we moved away from what I consider to be the founders or constitutional presidency. So let me sort of take us through the decline that got us to the point where we are today. Let me begin by noting that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and those three men had their disagreements on certain issues, but they were in agreement when it came to believing that the United States government, while it rested on the consent of the citizenry, all three of those men and many of their other founding colleagues were opposed to any plan of government that simply translated public wishes, public opinion into law. This was not going to be a direct democracy. We were going to be a republic. And a republic, according to most of these founders, meant that we would have a system of representation of various elected offices, and those elected officials were responsible for, as they put it in the Federalist Papers, refining and enlarging public sentiments. And this was going to be particularly important, many of the founders believed, when it came to this new office of the presidency, that the president was going to be uniquely situated and in fact had an obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not that public opinion or the latest public fad or public sentiment be faithfully executed. And so this founding core was very fearful of the tyranny of the majority, and very fearful in terms of their study of history, believing that throughout history, republics had been toppled or overthrown by demagogues, and that demagogues play on the passions, the fears, the emotions of the public in order to consolidate their power. So they were very careful in terms of designing the office of the presidency to make sure that a demagogue never reached the highest office in the land. And so Alexander Hamilton in particular, throughout the Federalist Papers, talks repeatedly about the dangers presented by demagogues, by the kind of pandering to public opinion that demagogues use to achieve power. And Hamilton was frequently a critic of what he called the little arts of popularity. And it was especially important for a president, who was our head of state, to avoid engaging in those little arts of popularity, because it would both undermine the rule of law and, simply put, undermine the dignity of both the presidency and, more importantly, of the Constitution itself. So there's this recurring theme throughout Hamilton's writings in the Federalist Papers dealing with the presidency, and in his advice to President George Washington, Hamilton being his Treasury Secretary, about the importance of maintaining presidential dignity and the importance of the president serving as a check on public opinion. He is not to be, according to Hamilton and Washington, and I would add Madison, he is not to be the tribune of the people, as Andrew Jackson will later claim. He is, in fact, supposed to bring a kind of cool and sedate reflection to the public square, and to resist the sort of temporary delusions, as Hamilton puts it in the Federalist Papers, that the public can occasionally be prone to and that demagogues will seek to exploit. So our very first president and his closest advisor, Alexander Hamilton, again, were deeply concerned about this potential for a demagogue and the potential for the tyranny of the majority. And of course, they created institutions such as the Electoral College. The original Electoral College was supposed to serve as a kind of filtering body between the public and the process of selecting a president. So you and I, as voters back in 1789, would vote for electors from our state, from each of our states, and those electors in turn would select the president. So Hamilton described the Electoral College as something that, a mechanism where the sense of the people operates. We pick the electors, and then those electors turn around and select, hopefully, a person of the correct temperament, a person of national stature, a person who's not a captive of parochial interests, a person who doesn't see it as his job to fire up the base, but somebody who looks out for the national interests. In other words, a head of state. And so this emphasis on dignity, this emphasis on enforcing the rule of law, coupled with, and keep in mind what Hamilton and Madison and of course President Washington are trying to do, is create a new nation. They're trying to put the Constitution, this abstract document, on paper. They're trying to make it a reality and establish a kind of American identity. And so Washington viewed this as priority one for the president, to convince his fellow citizens, as Hamilton and Washington put it frequently, to think continentally, to think of themselves as Americans first, not as New Yorkers or Virginians or whatever. And so as the personification of this new nation, the American president was supposed to serve, as I've said, as a force for unity. Don't stir the pot, don't exploit partisan or ideological divisions, and certainly don't fire up the base. So that was what I call the Washington and Hamilton conception. I call it the constitutional presidency or the founder's presidency. They're one and the same as far as I'm concerned. That lasts for about 12 years. It carries on through the John Adams administration. But what occurs, and this is a very significant development, with the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, we have what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800. And he reverses the constitutional, he attempts to put the constitutional presidency on the road to extinction. Jefferson refounds the office of the presidency, and he turns the office on its head. And what I mean by that is Jefferson is no longer fearful, or is not fearful, of this tyranny of the majority. He in fact believes that the people generally always reason well, that the people can be trusted, and it is the president's job, in a sense, to speak for the people. And so I refer to this Jefferson vision of the presidency as the popular or populist presidency. This is a presidency rooted in public or popular consent. And the highest obligation of the American president is no longer to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The highest obligation of the president is to implement the will of the majority. So this is going to be a small d democratic presidency. And Jefferson, just to give you a quote in terms of convincing you that I'm not making this up when it comes to Jefferson, Jefferson believed that public opinion was, quote, the best criterion of what is best. That's a direct quote. And by the president enlisting or engaging that opinion, this gives strength to the government. And in a sense, this is Jefferson's definition of an energetic executive, one who roots his authority, who governs with a mandate from the people. And so by enlisting that strength of public opinion, you are moving the presidency away from its constitutional foundation that I think Washington and Hamilton and Madison believed in, towards this more popular presidency. So a mandate from the people provides for energetic government, and as Jefferson said on more than one occasion, the will of the majority should always prevail. And so at times Jefferson flirts with the idea of pushing a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. He believes in the direct election of the president, although he never really follows through on that in terms of eliminating the Electoral College. But he's also a believer in things like a constitutional convention every generation. So again, this is a man with a sort of unbridled faith in the wisdom of the people, and that the people will always reason well. And as long as the government follows the will of the people, all will be well with the Constitution. So his belief in perpetual change, his belief that the majority should govern, is certainly an appealing one, and it appeals to the American belief in the consent of the governed, right? And what I guess want you to sort of think about today as we think about or celebrate Constitution Day is at least acknowledge the fact that while a system based on the consent of the governed and on the mandate provided by an electoral majority has a certain appeal to it, there is a price that's going to be paid by various groups that are out of step with the majority. And by the way, when I talk about minorities here in this case, I'm not just talking about racial minorities, although that would certainly be part of the equation, but also economic minorities, perhaps the wealthy, those with greater property than others, religious minority groups who might be subject to coercive laws passed by at the behest of the majority. So there is, I think, the beginnings of, under Jefferson, a movement away from the constitutional or founder's presidency, a movement away from the rule of law towards a more pure democracy. And that reaches its fruition, its heights, its zenith under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Jefferson and Jackson obviously had their differences. Jefferson was more a literary figure, far more of a Renaissance man than Andrew Jackson by any measure. But I do think Jefferson paved the way for the presidency of Andrew Jackson, which takes Jefferson's principles that the majority is to govern and implements them rather zealously, both at the state level, primarily at the state level actually, and to some extent at the federal level. And Jackson is a believer that as few impediments as possible should impede the will of the majority. So for instance, Jackson is an opponent of the Electoral College. He believes the Electoral College is a tool of the privileged. It's an elitist institution. And again, anything that stands in the way of the will of the majority in Jackson's view of American government has to go and is illegitimate. It's no accident that the so-called Age of Jackson, which witnesses a fairly remarkable expansion of the franchise to white, primarily, well, almost exclusively white male citizens. That's very true. And to refer to Jackson as a sort of champion of the common man is a phrase that one frequently finds in textbooks and in any discussions of Jackson. And it's true. What is seldom mentioned, however, is the expansion of that franchise for white males during the Age of Jackson came at a price. And the price was paid primarily by free blacks in the North, with the exception of New England, which managed to hold on or preserve the franchise for free blacks. Many other states during the Jacksonian era, as they're expanding the white franchise, they're contracting it for free African-American citizens. And of course, you could also say that Jackson's notion that the majority is to govern at all times with as few impediments as possible had a very deleterious effect on Native Americans. And we all know, of course, of Jackson's role in the Trail of Tears and the relocation of Cherokee Indians and various tribes. So the Age of Jackson, while it is in some ways an expansion of this notion of democracy and self-government, there's a pretty fearful price paid by, as I said, free blacks, Native Americans. And I would also add into that equation, there's a price paid by abolitionists. The Jackson years see a number of attacks, in a few cases murders of prominent abolitionists, the destruction of abolitionist newspapers. Again, all of this accompanied in many states by an effort to disenfranchise free blacks. So it's an era, the Jacksonian era is an expansion of democracy, but it's also an era of violence. And there's a young congressman or up and coming political figure from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who's starting to get very politically engaged at this point. And he is horrified by what he sees during this age of Jackson, by the violence, by a disregard for the rule of law, by what Lincoln sees as an excessive celebration of the persona of Andrew Jackson, of Old Hickory, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Americans in some ways are now shifting their reverence away from the Constitution and the Declaration, Lincoln believes, and towards this personality, this charismatic, no doubt, personality, Andrew Jackson, a bona fide war hero, no doubt. But Lincoln rejects almost every major element of Jacksonianism that you can think of. And of course, delivers that terrific Lyceum address, I think it's 1837, in which he condemns the violence, in which he condemns the lawlessness of Jacksonian America. And I think also he's condemning, again, this sort of personalized presidency, this notion that the president is the voice of the people, or the tribune of the people, as Jackson loved to say. Lincoln would say, no, that's not true. There are three branches of government. The people's voice is reflected through the Constitution, which created those three branches of government. We are again moving too far away from this reverence for the Constitution, for the Declaration, and becoming a more lawless society. And so throughout much of the 19th century, it is fair to say that Andrew Jackson's model was something of the exception. And certainly Abraham Lincoln rejects that model. Not that Lincoln isn't a strong president, he certainly exercises remarkable emergency powers during the Civil War, but that in some ways is a separate issue from the role the president plays in terms of his relationship with the American people and how he should conduct himself in a dignified manner. Lincoln does, in fact, conduct himself in a very dignified manner as president. Yeah, he told off-color jokes in private, but all of his public statements were crafted with great precision and skill. He's clearly one of our most literate presidents. But he's also a president who does not stir the pot. He rejects the extremism of some of the abolitionists. But he also, while he rejects slavery, he never personalizes the conflict between himself, between the Union and the Confederacy. I would challenge you to find any statement of Abraham Lincoln where he personally attacks Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee. You're not going to find it. So this is a man of restrained rhetoric. This is a man who tries to conduct himself in a dignified manner in the midst of a horrible situation. Hundreds of thousands of Americans being killed. But he remains firm to what he believes are the principles enshrined in both the Constitution and the Declaration in terms of halting the expansion of slavery and ultimately ending slavery in the United States. So needless to say, I'm a great admirer of Lincoln. I think he's somebody who combines elements of a more popular or populist presidency. He's certainly a man of, by, and for the people. But he's also a man who conducts himself very much in a manner similar to George Washington, with restraint, with moderation, with a great sense of dignity. And there's a reason why I would consider him, and most historians of political science consider him, our greatest president. Now, so the Jacksonian model, if you can even call it that, is really not followed by any American president, with the possible exception of Andrew Johnson immediately after Lincoln's assassination. And so that Washington founding constitutional conception of the presidency holds until you get to the 20th century, again, with the exception of Jackson and Johnson. And it's in the 20th century that Andrew Jackson is sort of revived as a role model for progressives. For those who believe that the government needs to take a more energetic approach dealing with private industry, corporate power, the role of elites in American society, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's somewhat ironic that progressives would embrace both Jefferson and Jackson because neither of those men believed in a powerful, big central government by any stretch. They were both, in many ways, proponents of a conception of states' rights and limited federal power. But what the progressives see in Jefferson and Jackson is that willingness to use the so-called bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt would call it, to kind of mobilize the American public in a war against, and they will use the war analogy, in a war against corporate power and industrial overreach. So the presidency of Jefferson, and especially Jackson, is vigorously embraced by those progressives in the 20th century. And I'm thinking especially of Franklin Roosevelt, who embraces both Jefferson and Jackson with a passion, creates the Jefferson and Jackson Day dinners that were commonplace throughout the Democratic Party in the 20th century. And again, they admired Jackson, especially his willingness to take on the elites of his time. Jackson took on the Bank of the United States, an elitist institution. And they both Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, consider themselves to be the voice of the people, speaking for the people. And that the other two branches of government, the Congress and the courts, to the extent that they block the president's initiatives, they are impeding progress. And they are acting, as Franklin Roosevelt frequently suggested, in a kind of un-American fashion by refusing to go along with some of the progressive agenda. And so Franklin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt are geniuses at sort of firing up their base by labeling their opponents as un-American evildoers. And so this is the presidency, I believe, that we are still living under today. Almost every Democrat and Republican president since the early 20th century has considered their ability to rally the public, to fire up the base, to be a centerpiece of their job. And what has happened is that they have abandoned this notion of the president as a head of state, as a unifying figure, as somebody who, if it's possible, should act in a magnanimous fashion, should not seek to divide, should recognize perhaps that his opponents are acting in good faith, and should refrain from appealing to people's passions and emotions. Don't stir the pot. That's been lost. And I think that's a sad development. And I think part of what I consider to be the dysfunction in modern day American government is traceable back to this sort of refounding of the presidency that moved it away from that more head of state unifying role that George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln believed in. And so, and let me add one other piece to this equation. Washington and Hamilton, but Washington especially, believed that character was of utmost importance, and that there should never be a high wall of separation between so-called private character and public character. They were one and the same. And unfortunately, I think we've erected a high wall of separation. I'm sure that's a phrase familiar to many of you, between what is allegedly private and what is public. If Washington, Hamilton, Madison were to come back today, they would not approve of that, I believe, that high wall of separation, that in fact, character really does matter. And the ability of a president to rise above attacks on him or his policies is key. Washington was attacked vigorously in his second term. Did he, and sometimes in a very personal way. People even question whether he was a hero of the Revolutionary War. Did he respond in public? No. No. Because he understood that if you engage in that kind of back and forth, it's never going to end. You're going to have a constant, both sides are going to constantly be stirring the pot and throwing mud at each other. And the price is paid in terms of the dignity of the office. Again, I keep coming back to this term dignity, but you know, Washington believed that it was of great importance. He believed that the way he acted, both in his personal and public life, was of great importance. He needed to act as a dignified head of state who tried to unify the country and not play on partisan passions. That has been, for the most part, lost in our time. Now, I do believe that there are some presidents closer to our time who still try to hold on to that earlier Washingtonian constitutional presidency. And I've spoken and written very positively of the presidency of William Howard Taft. Despite his large girth, Taft was a man of great moderation and great character, and acted as a dignified head of state. At the same time that he pursued a progressive agenda, very similar to Teddy Roosevelt, he did not engage, or Wilson, he did not engage in the kind of rhetorical excess that Wilson and TR did. He tried to conduct himself as a dignified president. And in fact, by the way, Taft set aside more land for public use. His Justice Department brought more antitrust suits than Roosevelt had. And yet he's portrayed by most scholars of the presidency as kind of a do-nothing figure who just happened to fall between TR and Wilson. That's not right, but it shows you that this bias towards this more Jeffersonian, Jacksonian, populist presidency has now permeated the academy. And so a president like Taft is never going to make it up onto Mount Rushmore. Of course, he might not fit even if they tried to get him up there, but you get the point. But Teddy Roosevelt does make it up onto Mount Rushmore. So this is not only a problem of presidents looking at their job. I think those of us who are scholars who study the presidency, and even American citizens who vote for president, need to perhaps reconsider the standards that they apply when they determine presidential greatness. So I think Taft comes close in the 20th century to being a bit of a throwback to that healthier conception of the presidency. I think Dwight Eisenhower does as well. Eisenhower took his head of state role seriously. He seldom engaged in personal attacks. I mean, he had a temper like no other. But if he was attacked on the floor of the Senate or the House or in the press, he didn't respond. And it wasn't that he lacked the technology to do so. Radio was around and TV was starting to come into vogue. He could have done it. He didn't. He maintained his dignity. He knew the importance of the president as a head of state, as a unifying figure, and did not debase himself in getting into sort of the personal tit for tat that characterizes the American presidency today. And by the way, when I say today, I'm not just picking on Donald Trump here. This far predates Donald Trump. The other modern president that I would say comes somewhat close to this earlier constitutional conception of the presidency, believe it or not, is Gerald Ford. Ford obviously found himself in a remarkably difficult spot, outnumbered in Congress. His party was in retreat. He ends up being defeated by Jimmy Carter in 1976. But for the most part, Ford did not engage in these kind of little arts of popularity that Alexander Hamilton and George Washington would have condemned. So I do think there are some modern examples we can look to, but I would certainly urge all of us who are concerned about the trajectory of American politics, and particularly the trajectory of the American presidency. We have a lot to learn from our past. And there are some great lessons there I think we could take away that might help restore the American presidency and the entire American constitutional system writ large to a more healthier state. So with that said, I'll stop there, and hopefully there are some questions waiting for me. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. There are questions are coming in. Again, the number is on the chat if you guys have other questions that you want to contribute. I'm going to start with a couple of questions I had, and then we'll go to audience questions. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, and actually there's a question from the audience that I'll get to on the same topic. There seems to be a tension or kind of a dance that the president has to do. So you're emphasizing the importance of sort of being dignified, of not riling up the base, being subject to the whims of the people, and yet the president has to be elected. You have the electoral college, but that generally follows. You still have to get a lot of votes, even if you can get slightly less than the majority of the popular vote. And so how does that play out with presidents having to be elected? And I'll just work another question here as well in terms of the process of getting elected. How do political parties play into that? And do political parties play a different role maybe in that whole process of election and what the president does today than it did 150 years ago?
Oh, no, no question, Paul. Political parties, and I could have mentioned, probably should have mentioned them in my talk, but political parties, I believe, could be part of this restoration of a healthier, more constitutionally grounded presidency, in that political parties used to screen out those individuals that they thought lacked the temperament or the character or perhaps even the intelligence to be president. They no longer play that screening or filtering role. So initially, political parties, even though they're not part of the constitutional scheme, in fact, most of the founders thought parties were horrible, they did begin to play that kind of filtering role in a republic that I think many of the founders would have approved of, at least that aspect of their role. In other words, just to give you a concrete example, it was the Democratic Party officials that forced Henry Wallace off the ticket in 1944, much to Franklin Roosevelt's despair. He wanted to keep Wallace, but the party officials knew that this man had some serious issues, and he did. In fact, he may well have been, if he wasn't a Soviet agent, he was surrounded by people who were. And he had some weird character flukes. But it's party officials, in a sense, that screened out Henry Wallace. It's party officials, I think, in the past that have screened out other potential presidential nominees for various vices. Now, was the old smoke-filled room of party hacks chomping on cigars a perfect system? No. Did we end up with a lot of mediocrities as presidents? Yes. But I will tell you this, I would accept a mediocrity any day over some of the more partisan pot stirrers that we've had in modern times. I would take a Benjamin Harrison over, it's my opinion, obviously, over Donald Trump any day. And so you had a kind of mediocrity, in a sense, in people like a Harrison or a Hayes or all those sort of unknowns from the 19th century, but they did no harm. And they kept the Constitution and the system going. So parties did have a role to play. They no longer play that role. I mean, look at 2016. Bernie Sanders, who's not a member of the Democratic Party, came this close to winning the party's nomination in 2016. And he wasn't even a member. Donald Trump, who as best we can tell, was never really a Republican in his life, and secures the Republican nomination against people that spent decades in the party. So that screening function is dead. And I think that's an unfortunate development. I think one of the steps we could do to sort of restore the presidency to greater health would be to increase the role of party leaders. Let me add one thing, Paul. Ultimately, this is all on us. It's the American people. Every 4 years, as you said, successful presidents have to garner millions of votes. Every 4 years, we fall for these appeals where people promise us, if you elect me, the oceans will begin to cool, the planet will begin to heal, as President Obama said in 2008. These over-the-top promises that we fall for. So it's up to us as well to try to restore this more moderate, disciplined, unifying presidency. But if we keep going for the folks who flatter us and make us feel good, this is never going to end.
Well, so to just follow up on that briefly, and then go back to more of a historical question that was raised in the Q&A or in the comments. How do we, I'm curious what your thoughts are. How do we do that when, with the parties and the current system, we really just have two nominees? Like you were talking about, not supporting demagogues. What if both parties are putting forward demagogues? I mean, it's kind of,
yeah, then you got a problem.
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22 of what do you do? So I'm just curious, is it more of a long game of just really education and starting from the bottom?
Exactly. It's more of a long game, Paul, I believe. It's the fact that I spend most of my summers talking to high school civics and history teachers about these kinds of issues. It's going to take a heck of a long time. It is ultimately on all of us. There's no easy solution out there. It's not going to come just from party reform. It requires the American people to stop buying into these excessive promises that are made to us every 4 years. And perhaps the day will come when a candidate will present himself or herself and say, look, I'm going to conduct myself in a more limited, more disciplined fashion. And I'm not going to see the office of the presidency, or I'm going to acknowledge a difference between the office and me. I'm just passing through. I will be inhabiting this office for 4 or 8 years. This is not about me. And so I will conduct myself in a more constrained, moderate fashion in concert with the founders' intentions. Maybe that'll resonate someday. Maybe.
Maybe.
All
right, well, let me raise a historical question that one of my colleagues brought up in the comments, which is you draw a divide between Hamilton and Washington, to some extent Adams, and then you've got Jefferson and the Revolution of 1800, and then you've got Jackson, and them as sort of the popular opinion should drive policy, and the president is sort of the mouthpiece and the executor of that popular opinion. And then you talk about Abraham Lincoln as moderating that, as thinking more about the rule of law. And so the question is, So we've got Jefferson's view on public opinion being important and part of what he should execute, and sort of the presidency is advancing that popular opinion. But then Lincoln says later on, quote, that public sentiment is everything. And so I wonder if you could comment on, does Lincoln mean something different when he says that, or is there a different context there? And obviously Lincoln gives the famous speech about government of, by, and for the people as
Right.
well. So could you comment again on that contrast between sort
Sure.
of a Jeffersonian and Lincoln's model?
Yeah, there's no question that Lincoln pays homage to the wisdom of the people constantly. The quotes that you just mentioned were exactly on target. This is a man who comes clearly from common stock and has a certain reverence for the people. The exception, or I think what sets him apart from Jefferson and certainly from Jackson, is for Lincoln, there were certain principles that were simply not up for a public vote. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the inalienable rights listed in the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution is intended to sort of protect those and carry out that mandate from the Declaration. So Lincoln's opposition to popular sovereignty, which his opponent Stephen Douglas thought would be the solution to the slavery issue. Let's just let the new territories, the new states vote up or down on slavery. The national government won't take a position on it, completely up to the residents of Kansas or Nebraska or whatever. That's not Lincoln's position at all. I mean, he just flat out says repeatedly, there are certain issues, certain principles that are off limits to a public vote and cannot be voted up or down. And Lincoln has some very strong things to say about Douglas's embrace of this notion of popular consent to handle everything. No, this regime, our country stands for certain principles that are not subject to a popular mandate. And so you see much more of that emphasis in Lincoln than you do in Jackson, and even to an extent in Jefferson, who ironically enough is the author of those principles that Lincoln so admires. So I hope that offers at least some clarification of the distinction between Lincoln and some of his predecessors.
Yeah. No, the irony struck me too that Jefferson penned a lot of those words. But,
Yeah.
Jefferson was a little bit, flighty in certain ways, certain aspects over time as well.
Big time.
In terms of his changing.
Yeah.
So I guess another question I want to ask you about this, and this is something that I've read a number of people writing about, again, bringing it back to modern day, which is the administrative state is here. What the executive branch covers and does is enormous, and that's part of sort of the general growth in government. It's part of Congress sort of absolving itself of responsibility for executing and writing specific laws and just sort of giving general mandates to various agencies. But given the size of the executive branch and the administration, how important do you think the person of the president is as opposed to the administration that a president brings in? And, again, for our current day, arguments that a number of people on the right would make is, okay, Trump is not a great candidate, all kinds of problems, and we can see it all the time on Twitter. But the people he's brought in have actually done a significant amount of reform, of restoring very kinds of constitutional checks. So how do you think about that, the sort of the office of the president himself versus the executive branch, and particularly how that's developed in the modern times?
Well, it is ironic in a way that people like TR and Wilson and FDR, who viewed themselves as the voices of the people and had a responsibility to implement the wishes of the majority, were the creators of this enormous administrative state that we all live under. No question. And there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. And I probed long and hard, particularly with Woodrow Wilson, who is arguably the sort of intellectual godfather of the modern administrative state, to find, because it seemed to me there is a contradiction there. How can you embed your office, embed in a sense the entire Constitution in public opinion, and yet create this administrative state who, under the direction of experts. Wilson was big on being an academic. He was big on expertise. There seems to be a contradiction there, but there wasn't in Wilson's mind, in that he believed somehow, maybe magically, that these expert administrators would always be working in concert with where the public wanted to go, where the public, perhaps a better way to put it would be where the public needed to be. Maybe sometimes the public didn't quite understand what was in their interests, and they needed this nanny state to take care of them. And I grant you, it's a bizarre contradiction but Wilson seemed to somehow settle it. I think he always believed that a kind of liberal progressive agenda would always be in concert with the average guy on the street. And of course, as we found out, that's just not true at all. And many men and women on the street see the administrative state as an enemy of their religious faith or an enemy of their economic well-being. You're a small business owner and have to deal with all sorts of federal paperwork. But here we are. The extent to which an individual president can make a difference, I think an individual president can make an extraordinary difference, if I'm understanding your question correctly. And the fact is that Donald Trump, even though I get heartburn over the way he conducts himself on Twitter and elsewhere, he has delivered, in a sense, on his pledge to sort of go after the administrative or deep state. And he has put people in there who have, in many instances, been able to succeed. So who we elect as president makes a big difference, if that answers your question.
But it would be better if they were a statesman with dignity
that exactly.
that comported themselves properly. And it's something,
Exactly.
I've talked with colleagues about too, something of, that it's hard to trade these things off where, what do you tell your children that this is what success looks like in the US? So anyway, it's a difficult time we live in. Well, let me, I want to comment on the administrative state thing. I was just recording a lecture the other day that some of my students will be watching this week, talking a little bit about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I think a lot of this is Rousseau's influence in various ways, where Rousseau has this conception of the general will that is not really just what people want, but what people should want. That if they were rightly informed or they had the right amount of virtue, this is what they should have. And so for Rousseau, the state is kind of trying to, his famous line, forcing people to be free. It's kind of this, that people will naturally in a commercial society devolve, have these sorts of problems. And so I wonder how much of that, besides the historicism, which is another part of it, right? If you take a historicism kind of view of history progressing, then what the progressives are doing and the experts are doing is just ushering in the future that everyone will be a part of and approve of.
That's right. By the way, Jefferson, Jefferson, I think, was influenced to some extent by Rousseau, but more so by this guy Condorcet.
Yep.
I'm probably butchering the pronunciation.
Condorcet is right.
Thank you, and glad to always get some reinforcement. Condorcet believed in the perfectibility of man, that we were on this path towards perfectibility, and Jefferson absorbs this as well. He's a believer in this. And, I would never go so far as to say he's the father of the modern administrative state. That would be a real stretch, even though I'm not a fan of Jefferson. But he does buy into this Enlightenment thinking that, we are progressing, there is an arc of history, and we are moving towards a certain level of perfectibility, which is why, by the way, you need to have a constitutional convention every generation, because the dead should not govern the living. And the living know things that the dead generation no longer. So there's this sense that, yes, we're always moving in the right direction, but sometimes the people need to be pushed by their betters.
Excellent. So I think maybe the last question here, and then it covers a lot of different stuff, so you can kind of take this in whatever directions you want to go, is coming back again to this idea of demagoguery. this idea of popularity. And I think I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, and you had a question or two about this as well, in terms of how modern technology and media affects the way we view public affairs, affects the way we converse with fellow citizens, affects the way that we get to know or don't get to know or hear from candidates. Radio to TV to now internet, YouTube, Twitter, social media, sound bites, and it's all very instant and it's immersive. And now you've got self-sorting going on. And so I wonder if you would reflect just briefly on how that has impacted this sort of rise of demagoguery and sort of the immediate, people can voice the being upset immediately, and it goes from their mouth to the Twitter account, and the President of the United States might respond to it like overnight. And so we might just say he shouldn't, but I wonder if you could just reflect on the modern technological era we live in and how that is shaping, and maybe what we can do to try to resist the way it's shaping how presidents act and how they appeal to the people and the public all the time.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, Paul. And our progressive presidents, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt, understood the power of mass media. Teddy Roosevelt is the first person, if I believe I have this correct, but to actually sort of create a little space in the White House for the press. And he's the first president to expose his family to the press, to allow the press to take photographs, to do profiles of his wife and his charming young kids and their menagerie of animals that they kept in the White House. And he knew that would resonate with the public, and it did. And it was a great source of his appeal and his popularity as a political figure. And that's, of course, just the print press. Woodrow Wilson, I believe, is one of the first presidents to record radio announcements, and I think more than one, but not to necessarily an enormous audience. And then, of course, Franklin Roosevelt uses that technology of radio to reach right into our living rooms. And so if you go to the FDR Library in New York, it is filled with letters from people who wrote to him saying, "Mr. President, I felt you were right in the living room with me, that you were sitting there across from me." And that is the absolute culmination of Wilson's vision of the president forming a personal bond with the public. And FDR plays it masterfully. And then, of course, John F. Kennedy with television, perfectly suited to be our first television president, and uses this relatively new technology to both arguably defeat Richard Nixon in the debates, because he just looked a heck of a lot better and wasn't sweating like Nixon was. But also Kennedy was able to display his sharp wit, his sharp intellect during, I think, 63 televised news conferences, which were televised live for the first time. And people tuned in droves because Kennedy was entertaining in a sense. So, and now we're at the social media internet stage. President Obama was sort of the first to be somewhat active on Instagram and Twitter and elsewhere. And then, of course, Donald Trump has used social media to the hilt. I think one day recently he had over 100 tweets or retweets in a single day. So this technology has marched hand in hand in terms of embedding this popular presidency. And I will admit it's going to be a major impediment to going back to that earlier conception. I still think there's a possibility that we might get so overloaded and so tired of constantly being at each other's throats that the media, social media especially, fuels, that maybe a candidate who says, look, I'm not going to comment on everything. I'm going to follow the Washington and Lincoln model of understanding the power of silence. I mean, Lincoln actually spoke about this. When he issued a document, people paid attention to it because it was rare. He frequently would say no comment when asked by a reporter. Well, I didn't say that, but he would not give them any information. So the importance of silence would be a possible attractive quality that maybe a presidential candidate could sell to the public that's tired of this constant media barrage, this 24/7 din of us being at each other's throats. Maybe it would actually work.
Yeah, well, I just had, sorry, a few other questions now,
Yeah,
small
sure,
ones
sure.
that as I was thinking about. So one, and this occurred to me earlier and I'd forgotten, but in the way you describe the presidents, a lot of the presidents from the 19th century who fit the sort of constitutional model, uh, what would you say to the comment, you seem to be suggesting we should have really boring presidents?
Well, I mean, to some extent, as I said, I would take Benjamin Harrison over Donald Trump any day. So that's a fair statement. Do we really want to be entertained by our political figures? Is that what we're
Yeah.
looking for? I would hope not, but maybe my take on this, it won't prevail. But to some extent, yeah, I am saying, if maybe I won't say boring, but restrained, understanding the virtue of silence, not having to comment on every issue from school uniforms to whether football players should kneel or not during the anthem. You know, that kind of a restrained, moderate, unifying presidency. Yeah, I'm all in favor of it. If that's boring, so be it.
We could use more of it. Well, and
Yeah,
the final thing, the final question, someone I'm surprised you didn't mention is, but I want to hear your assessment. Where does Calvin Coolidge fall and
yeah,
why?
yeah. No, I mean Coolidge should have. In fact, he would be an example of a 20th century president who was much more of a throwback to the constitutional presidency. The one exception, interestingly enough, Coolidge did understand and appreciate the power of media and exploited it to some extent. So those famous photos of him with an Indian headdress, and um, I think there's a couple of pictures of him with his dog and things of that sort. He certainly wasn't. He certainly was comfortable doing that sort of thing, and he gave frequent radio addresses. So he buys into some elements of the progressive presidency. But having said that, Silent Cal certainly understood the virtues of silence, and also limited his public addresses generally not to policy issues or partisan issues, but to discussions of the Constitution, the Declaration, great events in American history, again, playing that unifying head of state role. I'm glad you mentioned that. I should have included Coolidge in my list of 20th century presidents who deserve some praise.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the talk and the Q&A. This has been a lot of fun and helped me think more about some of the presidents, particularly in the early 1800s. So thank you again for joining us, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.